Hello class, this lecture and PowerPoint is going to replace Thursday's class. Before we go through this one, you should have already watched Real Engine, which is also uploaded on D2L. It's a documentary about the representation of Native Americans in, in film. So watch that first and then join us for the lecture. This lecture is on myth, narrative, and the importance of stories. It might be class session 33. I really don't know because I haven't gone back and counted. But one of the things that you would have noticed from watching the film, and also if you watched Misrepresentation, is that there are certain images and stories that are created by how we frequently see certain groups or certain populations or a certain person represented, and that develops our impressions, the stories that we have about that person, and over time, potentially myths and legends. So let's talk about what each of those things constitutes. I'm going to try and progress here. There we go. So myth. The definition of a myth is that these are tales which may or may not be believed as true. Okay, so people may tell these stories, but not necessarily think that they are true as fact. This is typically true of sacred stories, stories that have magical elements in them. Myths are frequently set in the distant past, and they have extra-human or inhuman or heroic characters. The extra-human characters, these are the gods and goddesses, such as Wakantanka, which you would have encountered if you've been reading Black Elk Speaks. That's the name of the deity that the Lakota Sioux worship, is Wakantanka. The characters are inhuman if they are an animal or another mythological being which would take on supernatural powers, such as a dragon or a unicorn. These are, of course, animals that have magical properties that we've heard stories about. They are inhuman characters. A hero is a human who accomplishes great feats in the story, which don't necessarily require magic or powers, such as Crazy Horse, who, of course, held great symbolic power for the Lakota Sioux in Black Elk Speaks, and you also heard in Real Engine how the character of Crazy Horse was referenced as an incredibly important real person, but someone who reached mythical proportions because of his heroic wartime feats. And so he actually became something greater than the actual human who is named Crazy Horse. He became a symbol of something. He became the symbol of the native people fighting against the intruding Wasichu. So his life became mythologized and is symbolic in that way. Okay, folklore is basically all forms of cultural knowledge that are passed down, usually through oral tradition. Folklore is very frequently oral, and this includes myth. So folklore can be any story. It can be an oral history, but it can also be the myths. The folklore impacts the cultural identity of the people that have the stories. It affects the cultural norms and therefore the social control. Remember, we've talked about social control as the informal control, not the political control of people. Folklore can very often be integrated into religion in that way and then becomes another reinforced form of social control. Folklore also impacts the collective memory. Remember that in building up an idea of an ethnicity, you have to have a shared history with a group of people that you identify with. And that shared history and what's carried forward out of it is the collective memory. And this is very often immortalized in folklore. For example, one of the stories that comes from Nagaland, which is that little part of northeast India that's kind of detached from the main part, and they have an ethnic nationalist movement that seeks to be separate from the nation of India. They have a folklore story that's a tale of three brothers, and I've included the link that you can go to and actually read it here. But here's basically what it is. It reinforces a cultural norm. It's a story with a moral, and the moral in the end, it has a magical element to it, and it has three brothers, so it has kind of that typical norm of three which always seems to appear in a lot of these stories. But in the end, basically the moral is you worked hard with your hands, you did manual labor, and that brought you your fortune. That is to say, wealth comes about through hard physical labor. That's the moral. You're not going to be able to cheat your way out of it. You're not going to be clever to get out of it. In this culture, what's really honorable is working with your hands. So that is something that that story, which is part of folklore, reinforces. Now, the Naga origin story actually comes from a rock spirit. Within this village. This village was very blessed, particularly this one family that had 4 sons, and it was because a spirit was contained within this rock. Now, the story goes lots of different ways, but one way or another, the rock was broken. The spirit escaped the rock, and then the family and the village became cursed because they no longer had the spirit present blessing them. And so the 4 brothers each went north, south, east, west to the 4 directions of the world, searching for the spirit to return it to their village. And this is an origin story that explains the diaspora of the Naga people, because they are quite globally separated, geographically separated from each other. The Naga also have a lot of folklore involving plants, and this is kind of a blending of the medicinal and the actual physical reality with the mythical. So there are some elements of this plant lore that's, you know, really very effective treatment for medical problems, and then there's part of it that's just story. It's just been told over and over again through the generations until, you know, everybody believes it's true. Now, Naga medicinal plants are a major part of their cultural practice. This plant that I'm showing you here, this is called an adle in English, or a mangjang in Naga. It's a staple food, it's a diuretic, it's a treatment for menstrual cramps, it's used to make beer, and it's also used for jewelry beads. So as you can see, you know, it's a very fundamental part of their cultural observances. You've got another one here called palm grass in English, or koritang in Naga. And this is used for actual medicinal purposes, and even used as ground up into a paste and used as an antiseptic. Now, the story behind that, of course, goes, and this is again the folklore being passed down to explain why the plant is used in this way. The story is that there was a man who saw monkeys binding their wounds with poultices of this plant. And he figured that humans could probably do that as well, and that it would be and that it would have healing properties. So so they actually use it to treat wounds, and it's based on this, you know, idea that at one point they saw monkeys doing it first, so they decided to use it. Okay, so now we move from this idea of myth and folklore into narrative. Narrative can also be called cultural history. It's the same basic meaning, but narrative can refer to the present as well as past. Of course, cultural history, we're talking about what happened to the culture in the past that's carried forward. The narrative can refer to what exists in the present and stories that are told about the present. Here's the difference between myth and narrative. Narrative is believed to be true as a fact, okay? The myth is believed to be symbolically true, to have some kind of greater meaning. In that folklore story about the 3 brothers, it's not important whether or not the 3 brothers actually lived and this is a historical account of their life. What's important is the symbol of the story, the moral contained within it. And so, so that in that respect, myth differs from the narrative, which is actually taken to be factual. Narrative is essentially a story that shapes identity, and it can also shape many aspects of that identity. And those narratives are then used to justify behavior on a larger scale. We see the best example of this is in the development of nationalism. We talked about nationalism last time, and remember that it's different from tribalism and identifying with just your local group, those to whom you are immediately connected. It's greater than identifying with ethnic nationalism, which is people who share your cultural history and your past. Nationalism is to is at a higher level. And narrative is very important to creating that. You saw an example of that in terms of creating the narrative about what it means to be a true American in Real Engine. They talked about how this idea of true American shifted from anything native to being embodied in this character of John Wayne, right? He's kind of this lone guy out conquering the wilderness, and he's honest and he's hardworking and patriotic, and that became the essence of what you picture as American qualities. Um, these narratives also justify how we make laws, why we go to war. It's been used to justify genocide. You can really vilify a particular group of people by telling the right narrative. You create the story about them, and then and that story is believed, again, true as fact, because a narrative is believed to be true. And this justifies violence against them. Again, you see that as we're going through Black Elk Speaks, that there was an act of violent genocide. The United States Army was actually sent to the Western territories of North America in order to conquer the Native American tribes, who basically wouldn't stay put in the one place that that the United States government had allotted for them, or wouldn't do what they wanted, or in some cases it was just a way of clearing out an inferior race, and that truly was a thing, because there was a narrative built up about the unfairness, the savagery, how uncivilized Native American populations were. And when you create a narrative about them that makes them sound like something less than the type of human that you are, if they are human at all, then they're a lesser human, then you find ways to justify their violent expulsion. And this has been used to justify genocides the world over. Um, now the flip side of that is narratives can also be used in a really positive way. It can be used to justify charity. It can be used as a means of reinforcing honorable actions. It can be used for peacemaking. If you create a narrative that is reliant on peaceful cooperation, that can be used very effectively. Narratives create cultural pride, which some find much value in, and as a means of binding communities together. And narratives also preserve culture. Most notably, we saw, myth and folklore accomplish that as well. But narrative goes a bit farther in saying there's more than just a myth here. There's a history here that needs to be preserved. One of the issues that narratives deal with is isolating information that is useful to the narrative. Okay, so you might you might want to get an idea of the interaction of Israeli soldiers with Palestinians in the occupied territories. Okay, and so say you go to Israel Today. I actually did this search. I found this image that you're looking at on Israel Today, and you search for Israeli soldier. And you get this picture, which is, of course, of a young man. He's doing his prayers, obviously very devout, looks like, such a nice young man. Now, so that is contributing to a certain narrative that Israel Today wants you to have about Israeli soldiers. Now, if you go to Radio Islam and do the same search for Israeli soldiers, the images you're going to come up with are going to be dramatically different. Now, both of these pictures, both this one here and these, are pictures of Israeli soldiers. But depending on which ones you put up in public and which ones you show more frequently, it's going to contribute to the narrative that you want to drive. And of course, this narrative is one of occupation. It's one of oppression and violence, rather than, the sweet little devout Jewish boy. Here's some other pictures here that I found from similar websites. So in looking at this, it made me think actually of a recent example that occurred in, I believe it was the Republican debate, and the comment was made that ISIS keeps killing Christians in the Middle East. So here's the thing about that comment. It's not technically untrue. It is factually accurate that ISIS has killed Christians in the Middle East. And what that does is that puts forward a narrative of Christians as specific victims of this violent terrorist group. But the thing that is ignored by that statement is the fact that actually more Muslims have been killed and displaced and tortured in various ways by ISIS, even than Christians. And so while not inaccurate to say Christians have been, it's kind of intentionally leaving out the broader picture, which when you know it, you realize, oh, Christians are not a specifically victimized group. In fact, Muslims are far more frequently killed or tortured by ISIS than Christians are. That changes the narrative. That changes the story that's being told. This idea of the single story is an incredibly important one that we're going to look at now with Chimamanda Adichie, who did a TED Talk. She is a novelist from Nigeria, and we are going to look at what she has to say now. I'll put this on full screen as soon as it starts.
I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer, and when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story, as had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I, too, am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind: the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now, this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Tyler, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America. When I learned some years ago that writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful, I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But the truth is that I had a very happy childhood, full of laughter and love, in a very close-knit family. But I also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps. My cousin, Polly, died because he could not get adequate health care. One of my closest friends, Okoloma, died in a plane crash because our fire trucks did not have water. I grew up under repressive military governments that devalued education so that sometimes my parents were not paid their salaries. And so as a child, I saw jam disappear from the breakfast table. Then margarine disappeared. Then bread became too expensive. Then milk became rationed. And most of all, a kind of normalized political fear invaded our lives. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Of course, Africa is a continent full of catastrophes, the immense ones, such as the horrific rapes in Congo, and depressing ones, such as the fact that 5,000 people apply for one job vacancy in Nigeria. But there are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it is very important, it is just as important to talk about them. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. So what if before my Mexican trip, I had followed the immigration debate from both sides, the US and the Mexican? What if my mother had told us that Fide's family was poor and hardworking? What if we had an African television network that broadcast diverse African stories all over the world, what the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe calls a balance of stories? What if my roommate knew about my Nigerian publisher, Mukhtar Bakare, a remarkable man who left his job in a bank to follow his dream and start a publishing house? Now, the conventional wisdom was that Nigerians don't read literature. He disagreed. He felt that people who could read would read if you made literature affordable and available to them. Shortly after he published my first novel, I went to a TV station in Lagos to do an interview. And a woman who worked there as a messenger came up to me and said, "I really liked your novel. I didn't like the ending. Now you must write a sequel, and this is what will happen." And she went on to tell me what to write in the sequel. Now, I was not only charmed, I was very moved. Here was a woman, part of the ordinary masses of Nigerians who were not supposed to be readers. She had not only read the book, but she had taken ownership of it and felt justified in telling me what to write in the sequel. Now, what if my roommate knew about my friend, Fumi Yonda, a fearless woman who hosts a TV show in Lagos and is determined to tell the stories that we prefer to forget? What if my roommate knew about the heart procedure that was performed in the Lagos hospital last week? What if my roommate knew about contemporary Nigerian music, talented people singing in English and Pidgin and Igbo and Yoruba and Ijo, mixing influences from Jay-Z to Fela to Bob Marley to their grandfathers? What if my roommate knew about the female lawyer who recently went to court in Nigeria to challenge a ridiculous law that required women to get their husband's consent before renewing their passports? What if my roommate knew about Nollywood, full of innovative people making films despite great technical odds? Films so popular that they really are the best example of Nigerians consuming what they produce. What if my roommate knew about my wonderfully ambitious hair braider who has just started her own business selling hair extensions? Or about the millions of other Nigerians who start businesses and sometimes fail, but continue to nurse ambition? Every time I am home, I am confronted with the usual sources of irritation for most Nigerians: our failed infrastructure, our failed government, but also by the incredible resilience of people who thrive despite the government rather than because of it. I teach writing workshops in Lagos every summer, and it is amazing to me how many people apply, how many people are eager to write, to tell stories. My Nigerian publisher and I have just started a nonprofit called Farafina Trust, and we have big dreams of building libraries and refurbishing libraries that already exist and providing books for state schools that don't have anything in their libraries, and also of organizing lots and lots of workshops on reading and writing for all the people who are eager to tell our many stories. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about her southern relatives who had moved to the north, and she introduced them to a book about the southern life that they had left behind. They sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, and a kind of paradise was regained. I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Thank you.
So that is Chimamanda Adichie. She's just wonderful. And I want to open up the discussion on D2L. There's going to be a discussion board, and I want you to respond to one of these questions that I've posted here. And however you feel comfortable responding. It's not a debate or anything like that. This is just your opportunity for participation points. And posting in the discussion board will be one of your participation points. So take a look at these. If you need to spend more time with this lecture, go through it again, pause it, take notes. Treat this as you would a normal lecture in class. But I know it is shorter today, and that's to give you time to participate in the discussion, and also because the movie is about 10 minutes longer than the normal period we would spend in class. Apart from that, I will be back after Thanksgiving. Keep up with your reading. Do the last third of Black Elk Speaks for next week, and then that will actually be the last of our reading for the semester. You'll have one more reading response that's due by your final. That reading response is to all of the texts that we've covered. So I want you to kind of think about, what did you learn, what did you get out of everything that we've read as a whole. Same word requirement, 100 to 500 words, just telling me what your response is, what you thought about it, what kind of questions and challenges the semester's reading raised for you. Okay, other than that, I will see you when I get back. Everybody have a happy Thanksgiving.